Hey class, today we're going to take up the second half of chapter 7, and we are dealing with pages 243 to 253 here. First we're going to deal with Venn diagrams in this first part 1 video, and then in the part 2 video we're going to deal with the traditional square of opposition. This first part is going to take us to homeworks 7.6 through 7.8. Okay, and so what we're doing in this section of the chapter is we are taking up this how to assess the validity of categorical propositions. And we're going to be using some of the same evaluative concepts. We're dealing with deduction in this chapter. We've also dealt with deduction, when we did propositional logic. Deduction also pertains to categorical logic. And we've defined a categorical syllogism in a previous setting. A categorical syllogism is a proposition that has 3 statements, 2 premises, and 1 conclusion, which all consist of a categorical statement. And we defined what those were in the first half of this chapter 7. So we discussed that in the previous videos. And so we're going to bring that all together now, and we want to sort of see how this all leads up to an evaluation of a concept of arguments. Now, to begin with, we need to define the components of a categorical syllogism. So you'll see on the PowerPoint slide here that we have it neatly broken down for us. So in the first part, we have here, let's see. So you'll see that we have on the first a third of the PowerPoint here on the top, we have it broken down into the names of each component. So we have a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. In the first premise, you're going to have a middle term and a major term, and in the second premise, you'll have a minor and a middle term. In the conclusion is where you have the minor and the major terms. So in the conclusion is that's going to help you to identify the minor and major terms. So the minor term is going to be the subject in the conclusion, and the major term is going to be the predicate in the conclusion. And then you'll find a minor term in one of the in the minor premise along with the middle term, and then the major term you'll find in the major premise with the middle term. So let's see. If we see this argument here, all egomaniacs are warmongers. All dictators are egomaniacs, and therefore all dictators are warmongers. So you're going to have the minor term here in the subject of the conclusion. You'll notice that this S right here stands for the subject in the conclusion, and the predicate here is going to be the major term on this side. And by convention, these major term is always major premise, is always placed first, minor premise is second, and then your conclusion will be last. It doesn't matter what order they go in, at least not the premises, but as a matter of convention, we'll follow that rule. And this actually puts it into symbolic form for you. So the M stands for the middle term. So remember that you had the major term is going to come in a predicate of the conclusion, and then you'll find it in the first premise. So warmongers is up here, and then the middle term is going to be the other thing, egomaniacs, and so you'll see that here. That's the middle term. That's what the M stands for. And then the middle term is going to appear with the minor term in the minor premise, and so egomaniacs here, and then the minor term here, and then the middle term drops out in the conclusion. So that's the components of a categorical syllogism. Now, what we want to do is we want to assess these, and the way that we're going to assess them is by using Venn diagrams, as we're going to go on to see. So I'm going to take you over to the, actually I could probably do the first one on here. Let's go ahead and I'll just make this into a pin. So when you do Venn diagrams for categorical syllogisms, what you're going to do is you're going to have 3 terms. So there's actually going to be 3 overlapping circles. So there's right. So you'll have what we had before, which is 2 overlapping circles. The one on the left is going to be the subject. The one on the right is going to be the predicate. Now, recall that we're taking the subject, the predicate, and the conclusion. So this is actually the minor term, right? The class, which represents the minor term, and this is a class that represents the major term. And then we're going to need one extra. We're going to need one extra term in here for the middle term. Okay, and we're going to call this M. So when we do this, when we assess for this argument here, we're going to reference these variables here, S, P, and M, to the terms that we have here. So dictator is going to be S, warmongers is going to be P, and egomaniacs is going to be M. Now, the way to test this, right, is that you're going to fill in the information represented by the content in the premises, and then you're going to compare that information with the content in the conclusion. And if the content of the conclusion is contained within the information in the premises as diagrammed out in the Venn diagram, then it's a valid argument when the content of the conclusion is not contained in the information diagrammed out for the premises, and it's invalid. So I'm going to walk you through this one here. So what you do is you're going to diagram out, 1 and 2 and see what you have there, and then compare it with the information at 3. So let's do that. So we're going to take premise 1 here, which is all egomaniacs are warmongers, right? I'm actually going to facilitate this, right? I'm going to make sure that we, don't lose track here. So egomaniacs, warmongers, and dictators. Okay. So now in the first premise, we're comparing 2 classes, and it's going to be egomaniacs and warmongers, right? And it's saying that all egomaniacs, so all things, here in this M, are warmongers, right? So anything that is not a warmonger is not an egomaniac, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to shade in emptiness. Okay, now let me back up here real quick. There was one thing I wanted to mention. When you have these diagrams, you remember that I told you, there's you can look at these as sectors, right? This is 1 sector, 2 sector, 3rd sector. Well, you have more sectors to deal with now. Okay, let's try this. So we have 1 sector, 2 sector, 3rd sector, 4th sector, 5, 6, 7. So you're dealing with 7 sectors within the circles themselves. Okay. So now here, notice that when coming back to the first premise here, you're actually shading out sectors 4 and 7 here, right? So just keep that in mind, right? When you another way of looking at it is this, right? So take, the take, the first statement there. If you just had those 2 circles, right, you'd have to draw it like this. So all egomaniacs are warmongers, right? All the egomaniacs are going to be with the more warmongers. So you're going to shade out everything over here. And then, what you're doing is you're just, bringing this information back over here to the 3 circles. And you notice that it's going to fall, partially, the shading is going to fall partially within the dictator circle. Okay, so now let's take the diagram. Let's do the diagram for the second premise. All dictators are egomaniacs. Right, so now you're dealing with 2 circles, right? This top circle and then the D circle. So all dictators are egomaniacs. That means that all the dictators are going to be up here with the egomaniacs. Okay, and there's not going to be any down here outside of that circle. Okay, so now that's the information that's contained in the two premises. And notice that we have this sector here, and this sector here are empty. Let's see what the information, let's see what information we have in the conclusion. So all dictators are warmongers. Now this is, let's see, all the dictators that we have are going to be with the warmongers. And that's what you have here in this sector. So the information contained in the premise, in the conclusion, is contained in the premises insofar as you have, a sector, where all the dictators are warmongers. Okay, there's no dictators that exist, in this sector, or that sector, right? All the dictators that do exist are going to be with the warmongers, and they're right there. So that's why the information that is within the premises is also, accounts for the information in the conclusion, or the conclusion, the information of the conclusion is contained in the information given by the premises, so that would be valid. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and try some of the other examples in the text. I'm going to go ahead and bring up the drawing board, and we'll work out some of the other syllogisms. We'll do an assessment on some of the other syllogisms. Okay, so now that I have this written out for you, I wanted to show you a way that you can do these Venn diagrams, which might facilitate things for you a little bit. You're sort of, doing the Venn diagrams for each proposition at a time, and then you also can bring them all back together at the end and test for validity. So, first, let's go ahead and draw the Venn diagram out. Okay, so just make sure there's 7 sectors, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then we're going to have the top one for the middle term, the left circle bottom for the minor, and then the major is going to be the predicate, so that would be drudges, and then we have robots as the middle term. Now, one of the things you can do here is just to sort of help you visualize what's going on here, and to take this in piecemeal fashion. So let's draw the Venn diagram for the first one here. It's saying that all robots are drudges, right? So, this is the middle term, and then this is the major term. Okay, now how would you draw this out? Well, you can take your the standard A-type Venn diagram, right? And it says, that all the robots are going to be drudges, so they're going to be in here. So there's not going to be any out here. Okay, so there's the Venn diagram for the first premise. Then you can kind of go back and bring it and overlay it onto this here. Then taking the second premise here. So we have professors. So this is S equals P, professors, and then the other the middle is robots. Okay, so now this is saying some professors are robots. So this is saying that at least one professor exists in here. Okay, that's the information that is given by each of these premises. Now we can go back and kind of bring this over here. So all robots are drudges would require us to put all the robots right along that exist with the drudges. So say they would exist in these 2 sectors, right? And then you would go ahead and shade that out. And then, we have, okay, so that's the information in the first premise, information in the second premise. There exists at least one professor that is a robot. Okay, so now that professor that is a robot, he can't exist over here, right? Because there is no robots that are professors, okay? And not drudges. So the only professors, that can exist are ones that are professors, robots, and drudges. Okay, so it's going to have to go there. So I was going to have to either go in one of these two sectors here. The information, the second premise, that is. Now, the reason it doesn't go in that sector is because there's nothing existing there. You've already established that nothing exists there. It's empty, so it has to go over here. It necessitates it into this sector. If that sector wasn't empty, then you would sort of the professors that are robots could exist here. But since the first premise made this empty for us, it sort of forces it over here. Okay. Okay, so now what information do we have in the conclusion? So it says that some professors are drudges, and if you notice here, that's what we have here, right? This is saying that there exists at least one professor that is a drudge. That professor is also a robot, right? But that's okay. That's consistent with what's in the conclusion. So the information contained in the conclusion, or represented by the conclusion rather, is contained in the information of the premises. So this is a valid argument. Okay, now we're going to go on to the next example. Okay, now that I have this written out for you, we can go ahead and draw the Venn diagram for this. Let me go ahead and write some adequately large circles here. Okay, and then count the sectors: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 sectors, and this is fine. Okay, now let's see, we're going to have the middle term up here, and the middle term is singers, right? So we're going to put an S. The subject is Italians. Okay, and that's the minor term, and then the major term is barbers. Okay, so let's go ahead and we can do this the way that we did it last time, just to sort of illustrate how that's supposed to work. So let's take the Venn diagram for the first premise. All barbers are singers, right? So you're going to have the major being represented by the first circle, and then the middle is the second circle, so singers. Okay, so all barbers are singers. So all barbers that exist would have to be right here along with the other singers. And so you're going to shade the left part of the circle. Okay, and that's the information contained in the first premise. The second premise asserts that there is at least one Italian that is a singer, and then the Italian is going to be on this side, singers on this side. Okay, so there's an Italian that exists here that is a singer, that is. Okay, now we can come back down and transfer that information over to the Venn diagram that has all three circles. So you would capture the information in the first premise by let's see, so all barbers are singers. So all the barbers that exist are going to be singers. They're going to go on these two sectors. Okay, so you're going to keep that empty. And I'm sorry, you're going to leave it unmarked is what I'm trying to say. You're going to make the other part empty. Okay, and then the next one is that some Italians are singers. So there exists at least one Italian that is a singer. And notice that that Italian can be in either one of these sectors, right? So what you do in a situation where you're not necessitated to put the X in any of one of two sectors where it may be, is you write it over, the boundary, the border, and this signifies that it can either be in this sector. And this sector here is where you have an overlap between singers and Italians. In this other sector, right, it's the overlap that includes singers, Italians, and barbers. Okay, so now we're going to look at the conclusion here, and this says that some Italians are barbers. So what this requires is, give me a second, and I'm actually going to write this circle a little bit bigger so we can see it. Okay, so coming back to the circle, I made it bigger so we can see it a little bit better. Now notice that we put the X here because we weren't necessitated to put it in either one of these two sectors, right? It could be in both sectors. It can be in this sector, not the other, or this sector, not the other, right? Those are the three options. So we just don't know. Now, this conclusion requires us to have an X in this sector here. Okay, only when there's an X in this sector here is this argument valid. Now, given the fact that we don't have enough information to necessitate that X to fall in this sector, that means it may fall in that sector, and it may mean that the conclusion is false, even though the premises are true, so it would be invalid. Again, another way of putting that is that the information that's contained in the conclusion is not contained in the information found in the premises, okay? So that information in the premises underdetermines the information that's needed for the conclusion. The information that's needed for the conclusion, again, is that you have an X in this sector here, the information in the premises won't give you that, not necessarily, right? It may be, the X may be over here, and that's why it's invalid. Okay, so now turning to the homework exercises, we have to do 7.6, 7.7, and 7.8 for this particular section of the chapter, and I'm going to go ahead and try to walk you through a few of them here. Okay, so the first 7.6 is really straightforward. It's just a matter of identifying the components of these categorical syllogisms. So I'm going to walk you through a couple of them. You just have to identify, you know, the minor, the major, and the middle term, and then you have to translate the whole argument into symbolic forms. So let's do number 2. Now, number 2, you have to identify the minor, major, and middle terms, okay? And remember that you know, the minor is going to be the subject in the conclusion. Let me take, you know, the predicate in the conclusion is going to be the major, and then the middle is going to be the term that is found once in each of the premises. So for the minor term, for number 2 there, right? No lizards or horses. So the minor term is going to be the subject in the conclusion. So lizards. Okay, and then the major is going to be horses. And then the middle term is going to be what's found in the premises once each. So mammals. Okay, and then you have to translate it into, you know, symbolic forms. So you know, the first one is going to be all. You have you know, the major premise, right? And the major term comes first, right? So it's going to be all P are M, okay? And then in the second premise, you have no mammals or lizards. So no, in this one here, you're going to have the middle first, and then the minor, which is the subject in the conclusion. And then for the conclusion, we have no lizards or horses. So no, there should be no P or S. No S or P, I'm sorry. Okay, so let's see, make sure that all squares away. Yeah, it looks good. I'm sorry about the bad handwriting. Again, I'm doing my best. If I was in class and I was writing on the board, I mean, it would be just as bad, maybe worse. And I apologize for that. I'll try to keep it as tidy as I can, tidy and legible. So you have to do that for every single one, and I'm going to just do one. You know, go over one in 7.6. Now, what you have to do in 7.7 is for all of them, you have to draw the Venn diagrams to test the validity of each of the arguments. Okay, so I'm going to give you, you know, or rather, I'm going to go over number 2 here with you. So we've already written it out, right? And so we just write out the Venn diagrams for this categorical syllogism. Okay, and then the M is going to be over here, and then S over here, and P over here. Okay, so we can just take the, you know, the form of it, right? It makes it a little bit easier for us. The first one is saying that, you know, you have your first premise, and then you have the conclusion. Okay, so all P or M. All the P's that exist would be with the M's. It would be in these two sectors right here. And so you would empty out all the other sectors of P. Okay, and then the second one is no M or S. So every M that exists is not going to be an S. So they would be up here, and you would shade out any M's that are S's. So you would shade out these sectors. And now you ask, is the information contained in the conclusion contained in the premises? And so let's see, no S or P, you know, and it is contained in the premises. So, you know, the no S or P is saying that there's no S's that exist that are going to be P's. And so, you know, these two sectors here where the S's overlap with P's have to be empty, and they both are empty. So this one is going to be valid. Okay. Okay, so on 7.8, you have to do three things here. You have to first render these into a categorical syllogistic form. And basically that means you're going to put them in a structure, you know, that we introduced at the beginning of the presentation. Then you'll put them in the symbolic form, and then you'll draw a Venn diagram to test for validity. So I'm going to take number one here, and I'm actually going to switch over to the drawing board. You'll notice that this one here actually has, let's see. So this 4 here indicates that these things are premises. Okay, so and the conclusion then is going to be the first one. So you're going to put the conclusion on the bottom, right? And then you'll put the major and the minor premise on the top, and then it'll look like this when you do that. Okay, so and that's the first part of it. So you just sort of render it in the categorical syllogistic form. And then you can draw these in, you know, in symbolized form. So the conclusion here is going to be, you know, some S or P. And then the major premise is going to be going to have the middle term first. So it's some M R P. And then the minor premise is going to be all M R S. Okay, so that's the second part. And then what you would do is you would test for validity using a Venn diagram method. So I'm going to go ahead and go through that with you. Okay, so we have S, P, and M here. And so let's take the first premise, some M or P. Okay, so remember, this is a case where you have the universal in the second premise, the minor. So, and then we use a rule of thumb, right? Whenever you have a universal in particular in the premises, go ahead and write the information for the universal first. So all M are S. We're going to do the second premise. So all the M's that exist are going to be with the S's over here, and any M's that are not S's are going to be emptied out. Okay, and then, so that's the second premise. Now let's go back to the first premise, some M or P. Let's see, there's going to be one place that can fall, and that would be right here, right? In this sector, right, then you have things that are both M's and P's. They happen to be S's as well. In this sector here, you can't put it there because that would not be an M and a P, right? That would be actually an S and a P that is not an M, so it has to go there. And now we look at the information, the conclusion. We ask, some architectural structures are non-traditional designs. So there has to be at least one thing that exists that is both an S and a P, and you have one, it's right here. So this is valid. Okay, now we're going to try number 3 here, and we're going to take this argument here. We're going to put it in a categorical syllogistic form. So you notice that this because is telling you that it's a premise indicator. So the things that follow are going to be the premises, right? And then the conclusion is going to be all worshipers of God are spiritual giants. So when you put it in the categorical syllogistic form, it's going to look like this. And once you have it in this form, then you can go ahead and draw it out in a symbolic form. So let's take the conclusion first, right? All S or P. And take the major premise, you have the middle coming first. And then the major coming second in at the second term. So for the minor premise, you have the minor first, and then the major. Okay, so now we can go ahead and draw the Venn diagram for this to test for its validity. Okay, and we have okay, so we have both universal propositions in the premises, so it doesn't matter what order we go in. So let's take the first one, all M are P. All the M's that exist are going to be P's, are going to be in these two areas here. So you leave that alone and empty out all the other sectors. Okay, and then all S are, I'm taking the second premise. This requires all the S's that exist to be M's, so they would go, you can't go there because it's already, emptied out. So they would be there, and then you would shade out, empty out all the other sectors. Okay, and then now we ask, does the information contained in the premises included in the information of the premises, and all worshipers of God are spiritual giants? So let's see, this is requiring that that any worshipers that exist be spiritual giants. It would exist right here. Okay, and so the information, yeah, in the conclusion is contained in the premises, and this would be valid. Okay, I hope this helped out, and we will continue on the next time with the square of opposition. Thank you.